Thank you very much, Cam, for that fine introduction. I'd like to start by thanking the Institute for Work and Health for giving me the honor of doing this lecture tonight. Never in my wildest dreams had I ever imagined, having attended several Nachemson Lectures, that I would be standing here one day delivering one. And I have to acknowledge that I am speaking here about the WSIB system transformation, but I certainly didn't do it on my own. It was a huge organizational effort with a lot of leadership at every level of the organization. And my talk tonight is going to range from the very strategic problems that the WSIB needed to solve and desperately needed to solve, to providing, I hope, some interesting, concrete examples of how we used evidence to fit those pieces together that Cam talked about to result in a system transformation. So we attended to things that may seem very small, but we attended to them for a reason, and together all of the changes that were made added up to, as you will see, a very dramatic transformation. I'd like to start by saying, in addition to saying thank you to the Institute for Work and Health, thank you for coming tonight. It's so good to see so many familiar faces, and knowing that your support and your assistance in the past has been very helpful to me personally and to the WSIB makes me a little less nervous. Policy, and I talk about policy in the very broadest sense. It isn't just, to me, policy that is created by politicians or policy that is created by boards such as the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board or by ministries of government. Policy to me is also how we choose to practice in our social services or our public services on a day-to-day basis. So the frontline practice may not always be written in a policy manual somewhere, but it does, in my mind, add up to policy. And a few years ago, somebody said to me, policy really matters. It matters a lot. And so does policy matter at every level that we can conceive of policy. And when policy is formed using evidence, the best available quality evidence, it is simply better than policy and practice that is designed or delivered based on ideology or opinion or my own personal experience. Those things can sometimes inform policy, but when they're at the heart of policy, it often doesn't work. And so we set out at WSIB to set aside our own received wisdom to some degree and to investigate using the knowledge of the best knowledge that we could acquire from around the world to determine what would work to fix the problems that we had. And we had a lot of problems. Between the years 1998 and 2008, almost every key indicator at the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board went downhill. There were ever-increasing levels of work disability for injured workers and ever-increasing levels of physical disability. So permanent impairments were on the rise, even though the number of injured workers was not on the rise. Injury rates were declining, and yet costs, healthcare costs, loss of earnings costs, pension costs were rising quarter after quarter after quarter for 10 solid years. It reached the point where the unfunded liability of the organization was so vast that the Auditor General stepped in and did a very in-depth analysis of the finances of the organization and concluded that it wasn't a matter of the organization mismanaging their finances. It was a very complicated series of political and stakeholder issues that had resulted in the WSIB not being able to address, not being able to bring in as much money as it was laying out. And the Auditor General recommended that a law be passed requiring the WSIB to deal with the unfunded liability. And the Auditor General also said that if the financial situation was not thoughtfully planned in terms of having a resolution, that he would refuse to sign off on the province's financial statements until such a plan had been developed, a credible plan had been developed, and that in a stroke would double the deficit and the debt of the province of Ontario. So it was very significant, not just to us as an organization, but to the entire economy of the province and to every taxpayer in this province. And finally, we had large numbers of workers who were being retrained, large numbers, 6,000, 7,000 every single year of injured workers who were being sent for vocational retraining because they had lost their employment with their employer, and the costs of those services were escalating and the outcomes were deteriorating again year over year for 10 solid years. So I was asked to lead some work to develop some case management practices that could help us to improve what we were doing at the front line. And we started out by, well, we did a lot of things concurrently. But one of the most important things that we did in terms of gathering evidence and to create the burning platform for change was to work with the Institute for Work and Health, and Sheila Hogg-Johnson was the Institute for Health leader, and I and some other colleagues at WSIB worked very deeply collaboratively with the Institute for Work and Health to identify what trends and underlying things were driving all of these problems. People not going back to work, costs going up, disability going up, permanent impairment going up. Why was all of this happening? And we called it the locked-in claims study. Sometimes we call it the long-duration study. But we were trying to understand, using our own data at WSIB, why we were having the problems that we were having. And it was really a seminal piece of work. We gave the Institute for Work and Health every piece of data that we had that we thought could be helpful. They did the analytical work, helped work to understand our language and our way of thinking so that they could really provide us with some meaningful analysis. And what they concluded was that it was a multi-pronged set of drivers that were causing the problems. One was that we had undergone significant structural and legislative change in 1998 that had inadvertently led to less and definitely inadequate on-site support being provided to injured workers and employers to help them to bring workers back into the workplace. And the term that we started to use was that we had abandoned the playing field. We had just walked away and moved into a very passive, observant model as opposed to a very strong, active service model. On the other hand, we were providing injured workers with unbelievable amounts of health care. People would go through round after round after round of assessment, of treatment, different medical pathways, to very little effect in some of the most costly cases. And despite all of the health care, a larger proportion of workers were receiving permanent impairment awards than ever before. So their injuries were becoming permanent at a greater rate than ever before. And finally, the third piece of the puzzle that they pointed out to us was that workplace behaviors had also changed in the decade 1998 to 2008, and that the WSIB's incentive programs were creating a perverse incentive for employers to sever their employment relationship with their injured workers, thus putting them into retraining. And that because they had no really strong incentive to bring people back into the workplace, there were some very detrimental behaviors going on. So, for example, they detected a very strong relationship between cost relief being provided to an employer on a claim, perhaps because the worker had a pre-existing condition of some sort, and the severance of that worker's employment. They detected a very high correlation between the time when the experience rating program costs closed on a particular claim and the severance of employment. So employers were managing claims to manage cost, not to manage recovery and return to work. And I acknowledge that that's a very broad brush to paint employers with, and there are many, many fine employers out there. So I'm talking about what this study detected at a very broad level. But why does it matter beyond the financial crisis? We restructured into a new service delivery model. We did a number of things, moving from very broad generalist roles to specialist roles. We decided that we were going to center our case management practices around return to work and recovery, and that we would, to the best that we could, use science, evidence, to create those practices. And we decided that it was time to get back onto the playing field. We had what we called a self-reliance model, where the workplace parties were expected to cooperate in assisting the worker to return to work. It clearly was not working for many, many workplaces, and we decided that we needed to get back into the game. So apart from the financial crisis that we were facing, we increasingly began to understand that there was a lot of misery being generated in the injured worker population by the failure to help them to regain not just their physical health, but to regain their working life. And we know from the evidence of the Australasian Faculty of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, the American College of Occupational Environmental Medicine, Waddell and Burton and Rueff, many researchers have indicated and have found the link between work and health. Work is a huge part of our personal identity. One study that I read said 1/3. I don't know how you quantify it, but somebody did that. You know, a big part of our identity is about what we do to make a living and what we do every day when we leave our homes and go into workplaces. The research also finds that people who are unemployed for long periods of time can have increased rates of adverse outcomes. The Institute for Work and Health told me at one point that in all of their studies, or in many of them, that were about the consequences of work injury, despite looking for it, they were unearthing significant rates of depression among injured workers, elevated rates, well beyond what one would normally expect. Some were mild, some were moderate, and some were fairly extreme. But this was an indication that people who are not at work, and perhaps in particular people who are caught up in the workers' compensation system, do not necessarily thrive from a mental health standpoint. And there were also several studies that found elevated use of substances, painkillers, alcohol, opioids, among workers who were not employed. elevated rates of marital breakdown, family breakdown, social isolation. And so we concluded, along with many of the scientists that we tapped into, that return to work can actually enhance recovery, and it can be a part of recovery if it's done well, and it doesn't need to follow recovery, and that people who are at work have a much better chance of being physically, mentally, and socially healthy than those who are not at work, not because they choose not to be at work, but because they've been injured at work. But we had to break this pattern of the medical treadmill. And good health care is fundamentally important. People have a right to it, they need to have it, and WSIB didn't ever want to deprive people of good, sound health care. So people continued to get what they need. But we wanted to change the mindset that existed with the frontline staff, as well as with many of our stakeholders, injured workers and their advocates and employers, that the solution to people not being at work is health care. If we just give people good health care, then surely they're going to go back to work. And in fact, many do, the vast majority do. But people for whom that recovery within the first few days after they're injured doesn't work need more than just more health care. So we set out to change the mindset and the mental model that people were applying, that problems needed to be solved by doctors. And we realized that return to work or work disability prevention is not a medical issue. It's an issue that touches on a whole array of people and processes and systems that Patrick Loisel captured very nicely in what he calls the arena of work disability. So when we set out to design our case management practices, we knew that we needed to attend to the workplace arena, to the legislative and insurance arena, our own house, and we needed to attend to the healthcare arena, and we needed to attend to what was going on with the worker personally and in their own life. And we set out very consciously and carefully to try to do that. So what did we do? Well, we created a team, a case management development team, some of whom are here tonight. And that team set out to really ramp up their knowledge and understanding of what the evidence said about what works. So we looked at anything that was labeled work disability prevention, disability management, return to work, vocational rehabilitation. And we needed some help with understanding what was quality research and what was just somebody's narrative opinion. But we did our best to synthesize for that small team what the current state of knowledge was around the topic of work disability prevention. And we then were able to start identifying, of all of these things, what do we think we can actually do something about or something with. And we created a group, and this was probably our stroke of genius, really, was we invited researchers that we'd been reading about, and some of us had met some of them, and we were impressed by the studies. And we actually screwed up our courage and picked up the phone and said, Dr. Loisel, are you willing to come and help us to do this work? Because we're setting out to redesign everything that 3,000 frontline staff in this organization are doing to support their recovery and their return to work. Are you willing to come and help us to do this? And we talked to Glenn Pransky, Dr. Pransky, are you willing to help us? We picked up the phone and we invited the Institute for Work and Health. We had several people from the Institute for Work and Health working with us, as well as Dr. Pransky and Dr. Loisel, and they were incredible. I mean, we were a bit nervous because none of us have PhDs, and we were thinking, oh, are we ever going to be able to talk to these people? Are they going to think we're stupid? They were so gracious, and they were so excited to be brought in to talk about their research and to talk to designers and users about how we were interpreting their research and how we thought we might be able to apply it in our environment. And we also invited them to come in and study us. So Joan Eakin came in and did a frontline worker study, which was really insightful. We had Ella McEachen did a big study on labor market reentry and had access to a lot of things about us and our organization. And so we became more open to allowing researchers to study what was going on with us, which took a lot of courage because we knew that they were going to find things that would be very uncomfortable for us. But we did it anyway, and in the long run, it worked out really well. So some of the questions that we asked the researchers in these, we had tables, we'd meet with them regularly, we'd show them what we were doing, ask them if we were on the right track, or we'd just pick up the phone or email them in between meetings to ask for their advice as we were designing practices and tools and protocols for the staff. And we asked them these types of questions. What works? What has a good possibility of working if we're not really sure if it works? Is it worth us trying it? How should we do it? So we know that return to work coordination works, but how best should we be doing it? Is our way of thinking of doing it likely to work? Does it stay aligned with the evidence that you have and with the understanding that you have? Do you have any tools already that you're willing to give us that we can adapt, or do you know of any that are out there that we could already use instead of starting from scratch all the time? And if we do this, so if we do A, will it influence B, and why? How do you know that? So we probed informally, and we learned a tremendous amount from them, and it gave us more confidence in what we were doing. One of the first things that we addressed was the need for return to work coordination. I mentioned that we had abandoned the playing field when it came to return to work. And a 2003 systematic review of workplace-based interventions had found that return to work coordination, among other things, was critically important to the return to work process. And this became known as this study was translated into what is now known as the 7 principles of return to work, which are still, a decade later, used everywhere in the world. And so we had lots of debate about how to do return to work coordination. There were some people who thought we should outsource it, we should let the hospitals do it, we should hire private providers, we should insist that employers do it. Well, we decided that we were going to do it ourselves because it was a big change and we needed to be able to manage it and tweak it and shape it in the way that we thought would work best. So we took the principle and the concept of return to work coordination and created a return to work specialist role at the WSIB that went into workplaces usually no later than 30 days after the person had been off work, and they worked with the parties together at the same time to talk about what the problems were with the person coming back into the workplace and to overcome those barriers and develop a consensual plan for return to work. And this was a big undertaking because we'd been out of this arena and had lost our expertise. We had literally lost it over the course of the preceding decade. So we really had to ramp up our knowledge and our expertise, and we had, I think it was about 120 people in the beginning performing this function, and I believe it since has gone down, but it was, you can imagine, it's 120 people going into workplaces around the province to help plan return to work. This is one thing that may seem very small, but turned out to be quite big when we really dug into it, which is the time that it was taking the WSIB to make the first decision about whether somebody was eligible to receive workers' compensation benefits and services or not. And the Institute for Work and Health found a very strong correlation between the length of time it took to make that first decision and time off work. And there was a study in Australia that found the same thing. And you scratch your head and think, well, why does it matter? I mean, surely if it's done within 2 weeks or done within a month, so they, you know. But what we came to understand was that the longer that a person is waiting for somebody to tell them, to validate that they've had an injury, the more it becomes necessary for them to prove that they've had an injury and to prove that they're disabled. And they spend time and energy devoted to thinking about how injured they are and how much they're suffering. And thinking about return to work is the last. They're worried about, are they going to get money? So they're very worried and very concerned. And work starts to recede as something of importance in their lives. So the sooner you can make the decision and validate that they've had an injury, then the sooner you can get on with talking about recovery and return to work and making that happen. So we literally re-engineered the entire front-end process of receiving a claim and doing what we called primary adjudication. At the time is now eligibility adjudication. And we wanted to make sure that we could make those decisions very fast. So we adopted this mantra of a day matters to create a sense of urgency in getting that decision made. And it was repeated all over the place, and it got to the point where the clerical staff who were actually receiving the reports of injury and inputting them into the computer system started to say, well, a minute matters, because they wanted to make it happen fast because they understood how important this was. And to make sure that we weren't deteriorating quality of decision-making, we instituted very robust controls. And the rate of allowance of claims actually went up, not down, and which was a fear that workers had. And we were confident because we audited and audited and audited, and I'm sure continue to, that the staff were making the correct decisions despite the fact that we changed the rules around it and changed the expectations of timeliness around it. Another thing that we talked to the researchers about was assessing return to work risk. Pransky had taught us, Glenn Pransky had taught us that if you can identify the barriers or the risk factors that might delay a return to work, if you do that early, you can customize your practices to address those things earlier rather than letting them fester and deepen over time. And one of the things that I don't know how many millions of dollars have been spent on return to work predictors and prognostics. I'm sure tens of millions. And that's all very useful work. But from our standpoint, one of the most powerful things that we learned was when Glenn said, you know, the best thing that you can do to understand if the person is going to go back to work is ask them. So we started to ask them. They're the best predictor of if and when they feel and they will go back to work. So we adopted what we called the powerful questions, and the researchers really helped us to refine these. So in our first conversations with injured workers, we would say things like, We're very sorry that you've been injured. How are you today? Have you been in touch with your employer? Do you think you can go back to work? When do you think you can go back to work? And the answers to those simple, powerful questions helped us to know what we should do next. And we would ask those questions on day 1 and on day 3 and on day 5, and continue to adjust our practices based on that. And of course, the evidence is rife that early intervention is critical. But what does early intervention mean? I recently had an opportunity to chat with some Veterans Affairs people, and to them, early intervention is about 2 years. Well, to us and to the scientists, early intervention is around 10 to 12 weeks. Or we need to do something very practical and very serious within 10 to 12 weeks if the return to work trajectory is not operating as it normally would if everything's operating smoothly. And Loisel told us that clear communication between all of the parties involved is really important. Cognitive dissonance gets set up with the worker if their WSIB case manager is telling them one thing and their doctor is telling them something else and their employer is telling them something else again. So all the parties need to be on the same page. And the only way you can make that happen is by everybody talking together, or one person coordinating all of those communications and being very consistent in what's being said and very clear. So we created a short-term case manager role that stays involved with the injured worker until about 6 months. And this role became focused not on paying claims, they do that too, but on managing recovery and return to work using the practices and protocols that were designed for them. And we needed to set an expectation. The evidence told us that the sooner that you start goal setting with the injured worker and the employer, then the better things, the more smoothly that the return to work process will operate. So we did set goals, specific, measurable goals, timeframes, what steps needed to be taken, who needed to do what, and we used the flags that the evidence gave us to tell us if we needed to do something out of the ordinary and what, in fact, that intervention might be. I can't say that we nailed everything because sometimes there just isn't enough evidence to help you to decide what you need to do in what circumstance. And to go back to this issue of the medical treadmill or the medicalization of return to work, it created, the term demedicalization creates quite a bit of controversy, at least it used to. When I first started to use it, I would have people standing up and telling me I was being disrespectful to doctors, and which is not at all what's intended. But we realized that we needed to do something to find a way to frame what we were doing, not just as in our language and our communications, but in our practice, that would get across that healthcare shouldn't be at the expense of return to work, and return to work shouldn't be at the expense of healthcare. They need to be done together, and they need to be integrated. So my colleague, Donna Bain, who's the Vice President of Health Services, has done a tremendous amount of work with her staff to create programs of care that address the best evidence on the best clinical evidence for particular types of injuries, and that lay out very specific and clear expectations for the healthcare providers that we pay directly to provide services to focus their efforts on helping the worker to return to work. So to restore functionality to be able to get back into the workplace, not just to make them feel better, that's important, but feel good enough that they feel confident going back into the workplace. And their fees were structured to support that. It wasn't, it was a very It was a slow process. It happened over a number of years, but compensation started to be based on to what degree that provider was able to help us to achieve our return to work outcomes. The narcotics problem, I remember being in a strategic planning session about, as long ago as 10 years, and all the operations people with almost a single voice would answer the question, what's our biggest problem in service delivery right now? And we would all say, narcotics, narcotics, because injured workers were being prescribed ever-increasing amounts at ever-increasing strengths for ever-increasing longer periods, and it was a problem. It was clear when we started to dig into the data that opioid use was at an unacceptable level on a whole number of fronts. And employers were telling us, very frankly, that they would not allow this particular person to come into their workplace because they were clearly on drugs. And we needed to do something about that. And so Donna and her team created some evidence-based controls on narcotic prescriptions, when they could be prescribed, under what circumstances. And by the way, the province of Ontario subsequently adopted much of the work that the WSIB did on how to better manage narcotics. And we need mantras. In our work environment, it's easier for people to grasp things if they have a handle to kind of hang it off of. So we created this term, better at work, which we hope captures the sense that you can get better while you're working, and if you're working, you're likely to be better off than if you're not working. And the last big problem that we had to tackle, by the way, I'm just giving you a sampling. If I sat down and listed all of the changes that we made to practice based on evidence, it would probably take pages and pages and pages. So I'm just giving you a sample of some of the things that we did. But the last thing that we had to tackle was this program called Labor Market Reentry. This was our retraining program that I've alluded to earlier. And in a way, it was, we thought at the time it was kind of the final pièce de résistance of our transformation, that if we could get this problem fixed, that things would be, we'd be on a really, really strong path to recovery as an organization. And it turns out that was probably true, but there's always another problem waiting around the corner. So labor market reentry was created in 1998. The legislation changed at that time. The government of the day, I'll bite my tongue. The government of the day thought that the private sector could do everything pretty much better than the public sector, asked us to eliminate our in-house vocational rehabilitation program and outsource it under the name Labor Market Reentry to a series of private sector providers. So we had private sector providers doing labor market reentry assessment, vocational assessments, case planning, and then we had another layer of private sector training colleges, private career colleges, actually doing the training. And we were paying the bill, and we had a pretty passive role in the whole thing, apart from referring the injured workers to these providers and paying the bills. So we tried that for 10 years. We did everything we could to make it work. There were 2 value for money audits done on the program. We did everything that the auditors told us we should do. It was still not a happy place to be. And finally, actually, this didn't trigger it, because my boss at the time, John Slinger, asked me if I would take on figuring out what we should do about this program, because the case management practice stuff had been pretty much installed. We were still working on it, but been pretty much installed. So he said, will you take this on? And I called it labor market hell because it was just such a horrible situation in so many ways that I was very reluctant to take it on, but he kindly pleaded and I finally capitulated and took it on. And then about a month after I'd agreed to do it, there was a series of front page stories in the Toronto Star really slamming the WSIB. Injured workers had agreed to talk to them. Their pictures were in the papers, their names, their stories. It was really damning. And the language that was being used was really heartbreaking. Workers talking about being trained for jobs that don't exist, about them being given certificates for passing exams that they hadn't written, being given certificates and nobody would hire them because everybody knew that ABC vocational school only trained injured workers. And in that community, you know, if you showed up at an employer's workplace and said, "Can you hire me? Here's my diploma saying I can drive a truck," or the employer would say no because they knew that they were injured workers. And that's a whole other story of stigma that I could talk about in a whole other lecture. But at the same time as the Toronto Star series was out, and I was doing my own deep dive into what was going on with the labor market reentry program, Ellen McEachern and some colleagues at the Institute for Work and Health were doing a qualitative study on the labor market reentry program. And I was on the advisory committee, so this is another example of how collaboration can really help, because Ellen was very comfortable and very gracious at taking me behind closed doors and telling me what she was learning before she was ready to publish her report. Because, you know, people finish their research studies, it takes 2 years or a year to get them published. I couldn't wait that long. I needed her to tell me what she was finding out. And people will tell researchers things that they won't tell agencies, public officials. So she got the real dirt on what was going on that corroborated a lot of what was in the Toronto Star series, but there were also some new angles, and it broke my heart. I sometimes tell people that conversation with Ellen just blew the lid off the whole program for me. It was like, we need to go back to square one. This whole thing is really harming workers, injured workers, harming families. It's really something needs to be done. So these were the complaints. I think I've mentioned them. Being railroaded, workers were feeling pressured to taking programs and courses that they really their heart wasn't in it, but in order to retain their benefits, they felt they had to go along with what was being proposed. The provider profit motivation seemed to be influencing the decisions that were being made about what programs to put workers into. Ellen explained to me that a whole market we didn't have any window of sight into these private career colleges at all, but Ellen did, and she said, there's a whole market that's been created to train your 7,000 people a year. And by the way, they're in training for 2 years, so at any moment in time, there's like 12,000 people in training programs. And she said there's a whole market that's sprung up, and they're creating programs, whole programs, just for injured workers. And as I mentioned, employers were pretty reluctant to hire them. So we knew that there was some perverse incentives going on there. And I've mentioned the training ghettos. So we found there were whole schools that had nobody in them except injured workers. And they were very highly stigmatized. They were demoralized. They felt that the quality of what they were getting was very poor. And when they went out into the open labor market, nobody wanted to hire them, very few. In fact, in the final year of the program, I think the employed rate after 6 months of finishing training was only 36%, and that was at a cost of $120 million a year. So we created a work reintegration strategy that kind of brought everything together right from the beginning of the return to work process till the end. If the person did need retraining, right until that moment when we finally said we've done all that we can to help to prepare you to get another job. And instead of thinking of them as two completely separate processes, this getting ready for the labor market and getting ready to go back to work, we thought of them as one single continuum. And we created a single strategic and policy framework. We used leading practices from all of the research that we'd read and a major series of disability studies that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development had done, and they had identified a number of leading practices in work reintegration. So that was the point at which this term work reintegration kind of came into our language. And we insourced this program. Apparently, that's very rarely done, to bring something that has been outsourced back in-house, but we felt that it was the only way that we could address the underlying systemic issues with our providers and to make sure that we could, again, sort of tweak this program to fit our policy, our model, and do it quickly so that we could be responsive and not have to work with 10 or 15 different organizations to make the changes that we needed. We did a massive policy overhaul. We threw out all the return to work and labor market reentry program policies that had existed. We rewrote the whole raft of them into a much simpler, shorter, hopefully plain language set. And one of the key things that we did was to encourage the staff, and in policy it was there, to have an unrelenting focus on returning the injured worker to their injury employer, because as I said, once they're out in the open labor market, their chances of getting quality work or any work at all are not good. The labor market is not friendly to disabled people in general, and injured workers have a special bad place in the open labor market. So we really wanted them to retain the relationship with their employer. So I'm just going to go to one of the policy changes that we made was we made a number of changes to the incentive programs, and some of that is still underway with the experience rating program. But this is a big deal. Changing the incentive programs for employers in this province around workers' compensation is really a very difficult process, so it is a multi-year process that is still underway. But here are some of the outcomes. And I'm just going to pick a few because there was a very rigorous performance measurement and evaluation or performance measurement and management process put in place, which, by the way, the Institute for Work and Health also helped us with. We created a state-of-the-art program logic model for return to work disability prevention. But in addition to that, we created a lot of metrics. And one of the key ones that I've alluded to earlier was the degree to which the propensity, the rate at which injured workers' temporary disabilities become permanent disabilities or permanent impairments. And it has dropped from 9% of all lost time injuries in 2008 to 5% in 2014, which is the most recent reporting year that the WSIB will make public. On the financial front, the layout of payments for loss of earnings has changed dramatically, as has the layout on an annual basis, as has the layout for total benefits paid. So that the total benefits includes health care and pensions and widows' pensions and things like that. So it's a significant difference. And at this point, I just want to reiterate that we had a financial crisis. The changes that were made at the front line were partly in response to that, but more so in response to, as I said, the sadness and the misery that we were seeing every day in our work. The eligibility decision time, that critically important first decision, is now being done within 10 days in 93% of all new cases. I don't remember exactly what the figure was in 2008, but it was probably around 72% within 10 days. And that has not been at the expense of quality. It's just been because of the process changes that were made and the sense of urgency that the staff brought to the task. And here's really, from my standpoint, being a work disability prevention advocate, these are the ones that just should rock your world. If you have any understanding of what happens in the field of return to work, vocational rehabilitation, in Ontario, in Canada, around the world, these numbers are unparalleled. So 87.5% of injured workers who lose time from work because of their work-related injury are off benefits within 1 month of their return-to-work specialist doing return-to-work coordination in the workplace. And we use off benefits because it is recognized around the world as a legitimate return-to-work measure. It can be controversial, but generally at this point, if a person is not receiving wage loss benefits anymore, it's because they're now receiving their actual wages. So 87.5% success rate on the part of this return-to-work coordination function. Almost 59% of work transition plans, these used to be called labor market reentry plans, except that now at 6 months we get a return to work transition specialist involved, and they continue to focus on return to work with the injury employer. So of those cases that they deal with after 6 months off work, an additional 59% go back to work with their injury employer. So in the past, these would have all gone to labor market reentry and the employment relationship would have been severed. The program overall, the work transition program or vocational rehabilitation program, where it overall is achieving an 80% success rate. So I've been involved with workers' compensation for over 35 years now, and the institution is about 101 years old now. And these types of results for people who are off work for beyond 6 months have never been achieved, ever. No matter best efforts, lay on of resources, never. And I would hazard a guess that they're among the best anywhere in the world. So we've done all of these things, but what do people think of it? Well, you can see there's a lot of satisfaction metrics that the WSIB has, so I just asked them for a few. But you can see that with the overall claims process, which is the case management practice that I talked a little bit about earlier, there's a pretty high rate of satisfaction, both with workers, but particularly with employers. And in terms of the return to work transition, so what we now call the overall work reintegration program, the satisfaction rates there are very, very high. And there's a lot to be very proud of there. So my final thoughts are working with researchers, engaging them in a two-way dialogue and collaboration, working together to form research, to understand research, to translate research, to use research. It creates alignment, and it's not a one-time process. So we'd get an answer to a question one day, we'd go away, we'd do some work, and then something else, a deeper question would pop up, and we'd go back to the researchers over and over again to make sure that we were on the right track and that we were doing the best possible design. And curiosity is very healthy. I tend to be a very curious person. The program development team were very curious, and we asked a lot of questions, not just of the researchers, but of each other, of our colleagues, on the front lines of management, and we challenged ourselves to think differently. And it's a very rewarding process. The degree of excitement that we had around this whole change throughout the organization just built in momentum. And as people started to understand what we were doing and why we were doing it, it was really magical. Relationships between the researchers and the research users need to be founded on mutual respect. So as I said, we were intimidated a little bit by all the PhDs and the eggheads, but they helped us to get over that. They respected us and what we needed to do and still need to do, and we respect them and what they can bring to the table. And we trusted them, and in turn, they trusted us and let us into their world, sometimes a little sooner than they might otherwise have been comfortable with. And evidence-based practice, when it's tempered by user insight and the context in which it's being applied, can, as you can see, generate outstanding results. And again, I'd like to come back to something I opened with. Policy, in the broadest sense of the word, matters. It matters a lot. And when you're in a human service function like WSIB or the Health and Safety Associations, evidence-based practice just seems to make sense. I remember Ron asking me a question once, well, why do you do it? And I said, well, why wouldn't you? Why on earth would you not, if you've got good, sound evidence of what works, why would you not adopt it and adapt it to your practice? Because it can make a big difference in the lives of workers across this province. So I'd like to congratulate all of the researchers and the WSIB staff who made this change possible. It certainly wasn't me. I played the role that I can play in it, but as I said earlier, it took an army of dedicated, committed, passionate people who did really outstanding work to outstanding results. Thank you.